What is up, you guys? Welcome back to the channel and welcome to another gruesome Get Ready With Me video. If this is your first time seeing my face, my name is Jessica and every week I sit down here and I talk about a true crime case whilst I put on some makeup. So if that sounds good to you, you've made it to the right place, and that means you should totally subscribe and stick around. I post new videos almost every week, so if you subscribe and you turn on your notifications, you'll never miss an upload. And with all of that said and done, let's go ahead and get into today's case. All right, so today's story is taking us back to the 80s again, which randomly has been a very heavily covered time period on my channel over the last couple of months. Lots of trips back to big hair, the Brat Pack, and parachute pants for us recently. But evidently that's what you all want to see because this case is, in fact, another request. This one is coming to us courtesy of our friend Courtney. So if everyone could please take a minute in the comments to thank Courtney for this story because, woof. It's a doozy. Y'all ready to hear somebody get away with murder? Yeah, this is that kind of story, so buckle up, my friends. Today, we're going to be getting into the story of Fran Balden Jr., Joelle Tillis, and Brenda Spicer. So our story today takes us down to the southern United States, Louisiana, to be specific. Oh shoot, we were in Louisiana last week too, weren't we? Louisiana and the 80s. That's what y'all want. So we're gonna hit a couple different cities overall because we do have 3 different heavy hitters in today's story, but for the most part, the majority of what we're going to discuss takes place in Monroe. With a population steadily hovering around 50,000 people, Monroe, Louisiana sits on just under 33 square miles of land, and it is best known for its zoo, its museum, and of course, its incredible Southern cuisine. Oh, and it was also where Coca-Cola was first bottled by the Balden Candy Company, so lots of interesting and rich history down in Monroe. However, before we get into the chunk of our story today that actually takes place there, we first have to take a little field trip even further south, about an hour, to where Brenda Lee Spicer was born. Brenda Lee Spicer was born on June 4th, 1968 in Gina, Louisiana, which, if you're not familiar, is located in LaSalle Parish. As we discussed last week, Louisiana breaks their shit down into parishes rather than counties. And to further pinpoint, geographically speaking, where LaSalle Parish is, it sits pretty much right in the middle of the calf portion of the boot that makes up Louisiana.
What are you talking about?
Now, unfortunately, I wasn't able to find even remotely as much about Brenda or her childhood as I would typically like to, but I can and will tell you the few things that I was able to find. For starters, I know that she was born into a fairly well-off family. I believe upper middle class is how I've most frequently seen it described. Beyond that, though, I don't know her parents' names. I don't know what they did for a living. I don't know how many siblings she had. I do know for a fact that she had at least one brother, but other than that, I just know that her family has been described as diligent and hardworking. Believe me, I wish I had more to give you as far as Brenda's upbringing is concerned. All I know, though, is that it was a good one. She had a good family dynamic, she had loving parents, and overall she was a relatively happy girl. As far as what is on record for Brenda, though, most of what I can find seems to start right around when she was in the 4th grade. And that period of time in Brenda's life is significant because that is when Brenda discovered her love and passion for basketball. From the moment that Brenda first stepped out on the court, she was a natural. Her talent and potential were recognized pretty much right away from her coaches, her teammates, and her parents. Despite how young she was very dedicated and she was super hardworking. And she even had those like tiny little plastic play basketball hoops in her bedroom and her bathroom at home. Basically, she ate, slept, and breathed basketball from the 4th grade on. And by the time junior high rolled around, she had become something of a small town hero. She was loved by all. Not only did she frequently lead her team to victory, but she was also just overall a really sweet and genuine person. Things for Brenda were going so incredibly well in her life that she actually found herself drawn to using whatever free time she did have, which wasn't a lot, but she took that time and she used it to try and advocate for other people that she felt were being treated unfairly. She was even known for writing papers protesting racism as early as like middle school. And while I think there is definitely a much more widespread understanding of racism and white privilege and social inequalities in general amongst our youths nowadays, back in the South, in the 70s, Brenda was a trailblazer. Her empathy and her progressive style of thinking was just beyond admirable. But that's not to say that it didn't come without its fair share of criticisms, because of course it did. But honestly, Brenda didn't care. She did not think that someone's age, race, color, socioeconomic standing, education, anything like that. Those things did not matter to Brenda. To her, people were people, and there was no hierarchy, which again is such amazing and progressive thinking from such a young girl in such a divisive time in history. So kudos to her. Unfortunately, though, Brenda's outspokenness and her small town notoriety eventually did make her a target for more than just words or passive judgments. When Brenda was just 15 years old, while attending a high school football game, a group of boys actually followed her into the bathroom. They locked her in with them, they turned off all of the lights, and they proceeded to take turns violently raping her. And this experience was obviously so incredibly traumatic for Brenda. The entire time that it was happening, all she could do was wonder why. She was kind to everyone. So how could this be happening to her? How could people, peers of hers, whom she'd undoubtedly only ever been nice to, how could they want to do this to her? I mean, it should go without saying that this experience rocked Brenda's entire world, especially when you consider the fact that while Brenda did try to report the assault, because it had been basically a blitz attack, because the perpetrators had turned the lights off in the bathroom before taking their turns with her in the pitch black darkness, ultimately, Brenda was never able to definitively identify who was responsible for what had happened to her. And because this was way before DNA science or really any of the forensic techniques that we rely on so heavily today, these boys were never caught. They were never charged, and Brenda was forced to just move on. She never saw any justice for this horrific event that completely changed her life. But while these boys had taken so much from Brenda with what they'd done to her, one thing that she absolutely refused to let them strip her of was her future. She was not about to let what had happened to her keep her from pursuing her goals. And so, bypassing numerous other scholarships, after graduating high school in 1986, Brenda enrolled as an accounting major at Northwest Louisiana University. And just to clarify, accounting was not Brenda's dream. She'd actually only picked that major at the behest of her mother. But Brenda's dream, for as long as she could remember, was to play basketball for NLU's Lady Indians basketball team. Sidebar, NLU changed its name from Northeast Louisiana University to the University of Louisiana at Monroe on August 27th, 1999. And then on June 26th, 2006, the University of Louisiana at Monroe officially changed its mascot from the Indians to the Warhawks, which, thank God, because yikes. Like, how long are we going to ignorantly perpetuate this term that was given to these people by one of the grossest dudes in history? Sorry, like I said, that shit bugs the fuck out of me, but I digress. For now, back to Brenda. She arrived on campus at NLU in the fall of 1986, where she was assigned a dorm within the student athlete housing section. And this was actually pretty nice as far as like college housing is concerned. Not that I think that really mattered to Brenda. I think her main concern was getting to know and to bond with her new teammates, which living in the athlete housing, she definitely got the opportunity to do. As I've mentioned, Brenda was always kind and she was very open and inviting to everyone, so she never really had any trouble making friendships. Pretty much all of her teammates, as they got to know her, liked her. What was a little bit unexpected, though, as Brenda acclimated to college life, was her budding friendship with senior teammate Joelle Tillis. Once the two had met, Joelle pretty quickly, sort of inadvertently, became a role model and a mentor to Brenda, almost like a big sister of sorts. Joelle LaShawn Tillis was born on January 30th, 1965 in Hammond, Louisiana. She was one of 3 daughters raised by a single mother who worked her ass off to try and provide for her children. Joelle's father left the family when she was just around 7 years old, and from that point on, it was basically just she and her mother and her sisters against the world. Even when her mother did remarry, Joelle, being the oldest, still felt as though it was her responsibility, that she owed it to her mother to continue to work hard and to become the absolute best that she could be. Joelle is often referred to as a chronic peacekeeper. She was always doing everything she could to make sure that everyone was getting along and that everyone around her was happy. And that is a theme that you will see continue throughout the course of this entire story. Joelle was also incredibly athletic. She enjoyed a multitude of sports throughout her youth. In fact, she even made history as being the first Black person to play for a boys' Little League team, which is freaking awesome. But given the fact that she would eventually grow to just over 6 foot, Joelle was always significantly taller than the majority of her classmates. Therefore, basketball was where she really shined. She was actually sought out by a recruiter for NLU and offered a scholarship to play for their Division I women's basketball team. She accepted, and she began her academic and athletic career at NLU in the fall of 1983. Obviously, we know that 3 years later, this is where she would go on to meet Brenda, but years before that friendship would blossom, Joelle actually met and formed a very important relationship to a different NLU student. During her first year at NLU, Joelle met and befriended 19-year-old sophomore Ivan Balden Jr. The two seemed to have a lot in common, and therefore it did not take them long to strike up a friendship. However, as the two got to know each other more and more, eventually that friendship parlayed itself into a whirlwind romance. But who is Ivan? Well, Ivan Balden Jr. was born into an upper middle class family in Shreveport, Louisiana in, I believe, 1964. It might have been 1963, but I'm pretty sure it was 64. Much like Joelle, Ivan was fiercely competitive, striving for nothing short of perfection throughout pretty much his entire academic career. Throughout his time at Fair Park High School, Ivan was an honor student. He was an American Legion Boys State delegate, whatever the fuck that is. He served as student council president, National Honor Society vice president, varsity basketball captain, and by his senior year, he had secured an academic scholarship to attend NLU's pre-med program. I mean, from the outside looking in, it kind of seemed as though there wasn't anything that Ivan couldn't do if he set his mind to it. I suppose you could say that was thanks to his parents, although Ivan might not necessarily agree, because while Ivan would meet and exceed most parents' expectations, his parents in particular had expectations that superseded high and went just like straight to a whole other galaxy. For example, I just listed off Ivan's many accomplishments. Accomplishments that would make most parents cream their pants. Pardon the expression. But when it came to Ivan's parents, they were much more likely to focus on what he didn't achieve versus what he did. Like when the Shreveport Times published an article predicting that Ivan's longtime academic rival, Donna Gale Yarborough, was set to be Fair Park High's valedictorian by a margin of 0.004%. I am not kidding. Donna held an average GPA of 4.357, while Ivan was slanted to come in as salutatorian with an average GPA of 4.353, a difference of 0.004. The problem with this, though, was that second best was not acceptable for Ivan's parents, even if it was by such a minuscule difference. Their son had to be the best. They were so upset by this whole valedictorian, salutatorian mess that they actually ended up going to the school, approaching the administration, and convincing them to allow Ivan to take basically an extra credit math course in order to raise his GPA. And the school, they let him. Yeah, they let him take the class, which was not offered to Donna, by the way. And this gave Ivan the opportunity to edge her out of her valedictorian spot, which he did. Donna was stripped of her title. It was instead given to Ivan, and Ivan was taught that if you throw enough money or status at something, you're kind of untouchable. A theme that you will see him continue to carry throughout the course of the rest of our story. He especially applied this towards his relationship with Joelle. Ivan showered her with pretty much anything and everything that she could possibly dream of. Computers, jewelry, vacations. He bought her a car. Ivan was given a substantial amount of money at the beginning of each and every semester, more than most students could ever even wish to have. And on top of that, even if he blew through it faster than expected, all he had to do was phone home to mommy and daddy, and they'd top him right back off. And this was crazy to Joelle, because if you'll cast your memory back, she had grown up, for the most part, pretty poor. So all this money and all these gifts, I mean, it was a dream to her. What was really ironic, though, is that a childhood like Joelle had kind of seemed to be secretly Ivan's dream. As he and Joelle's relationship progressed, he began accompanying her home for certain holidays. And according to her family, Ivan celebrated these occasions with almost a childlike glee, as if with her and her family was the first time that he was really getting to experience all these things. And this was actually something that the Tillises thought was charming and endearing. They took a very quick and very strong liking towards Ivan, a sentiment that was not shared by Ivan's family regarding Joelle. No, the Baldens seemed to look down on Joelle. They viewed her as sort of a gold digger. They assumed that the only reason she had taken an interest in Ivan was solely because of his money, and they figured that now that she had her hooks into him, she was just going to ride his coattails throughout the duration of their relationship. And Joelle absolutely picked up on this indifference, I guess we'll call it, that was coming from Ivan's family. But given that his relationship with his own family was fractured at best, he had no problem sheltering Joelle from them and kind of keeping them at an arm's length. Eventually, it got to a point where they were spending almost all of their time away from campus with Joelle's family. They rarely ever made a point to visit Ivan's. Ivan even eventually began listing Joelle's mother as his next of kin and his emergency contact on his documents for school. It really seemed as though Ivan cared very deeply for Joelle, so much so that he was willing to basically write off his entire family just for her comfort. A gesture that meant a lot to Joelle, but also to her family. It really seems as though the Tillises viewed Ivan and his relationship with Joelle through rose-colored glasses. And unfortunately, this caused them to unintentionally gloss over some, now in hindsight, pretty alarming red flags, like Ivan's hyper-competitiveness with Joelle. For example, if Joelle would do particularly well in a basketball game, rather than telling her so, Ivan would instead criticize any point in the game that he'd seen that he believed she could have done better. You know, kind of like how he had always hated when his parents had done to him. Yeah, turns out apple doesn't fall so far from the tree. And given the fact that both Joelle and Ivan had very headstrong and assertive personalities, this definitely led them into more than just a few arguments. Actually, the longer the two were together, the more and more they fought. Ivan gradually became controlling of Joelle. He was possessive. He wanted to dictate where she spent her time, which, spoiler alert, he always wanted to be with him. And at first, Joelle kind of found this charming. She thought it was endearing that he seemed to care about her so much and that he wanted to spend so much time with her. But over time, as he became more controlling and more possessive over where she was or what she was doing, she really grew to resent this behavior. His facade started to slip, and she began to see him for what he really was, which was an abuser. They were constantly breaking up and getting back together and breaking up and getting back together and breaking up and getting back together over and over and over again in just a toxic, vicious cycle. As time went on, Joelle actually found herself really excited for the day that Ivan would finally graduate and just leave NLU once and for all. She figured that it would be so much easier to permanently end their relationship if he wasn't, just around all the time. Unfortunately, though, when that time did finally come, when Ivan graduated and he was headed off to New Orleans to attend medical school at LSU, he somehow managed to still keep Joelle under his thumb, even from almost 200 miles away. It started with him insisting that he spend the summer with her at her family's house. I mean, she couldn't really break up with him then. I mean, that would have been awkward. And then by the time that he actually moved to New Orleans and Joelle was set to start her senior year at NLU, Ivan proposed to her, something that a habitual people pleaser like Joelle had a really difficult time declining in the moment. And so, as the fall of 1986 rolled around, Ivan began his first year of medical school, believing that he was engaged, and Joelle began her final year at NLU, pretending she wasn't. Now, she didn't go as far as to tell people that they were broken up or anything like that, because I guess they technically weren't. She more so just didn't really talk about Ivan at all. She really didn't feel like she could. For the most part, everyone at the school knew Ivan, and they thought that he was just the bee's knees. Ivan's high school guidance counselor has even gone on the record as saying that he was one of the nicest young men that he had ever known. So I guess that was a facade that Ivan kept up throughout his time at NLU as well. It really wasn't until Joelle met Brenda that she finally felt as though she had found someone objective that she could share her feelings with. Someone who could listen and digest without any personal stake in the situation everything that Joelle was going through and everything that she was feeling. And then on the flip side of that, Joelle showed Brenda the ropes at NLU. She served as sort of a liaison between Brenda and the upper class teammates. It was a very mutually beneficial friendship, pretty much straight away. And then, before they knew it, the two girls had become pretty much inseparable. Meanwhile, down in New Orleans, Ivan was not doing so well. For the first time in his entire life, he actually found himself not just struggling academically, but quickly falling behind in his entire med school course load. Up to this point, it had been fairly effortless for Ivan to glide through school, but for some reason, med school was just proving to be much more difficult than he ever could have anticipated. And this was especially frustrating to him because with as much as he was struggling, this left very little time, if any, for him to step away from school and to go and visit Joelle. It was almost like he could feel the distance growing between them, and there was very little that he could do about it. I mean, he was hundreds of miles away from her. He was going crazy. The more he and Joelle's relationship seemed to disintegrate, the harder Ivan tried to hold on to what was left of it, the more possessive and controlling he tried to become. He even went so far as to demand that Joelle limit the amount of time she was spending with her new best friend. Yeah, over the weeks that they had known each other, Ivan had heard more than enough from Joelle about Brenda, and he almost felt as though he was losing his girlfriend to this random miscellaneous freshman, especially when Brenda injured herself during her very first practice, re-aggravating an old knee injury enough to need surgery, effectively benching her for the season. Ivan could not comprehend why Joelle felt as though she should still be spending so much time as a shoulder for this girl to cry on. Seriously, he did everything he could possibly think of to try and destroy this, dare I say, sisterhood that was forming between Joelle and Brenda. From demanding that Joelle distance herself from her new friend to straight up banishing Brenda from the vicinity whenever he did manage to visit Joelle. He even went so far as to start a rumor around campus that the two of them were lovers? Sorry, I really hate that word. But yeah, he started spreading rumors around that Brenda and Joelle were sexually involved, and and this ultimately damaged their relationship with not just their teammates, but also with their coaches as well. Okay, so without going off on too much of a side tangent, just a year earlier in 1985, the National Collegiate Athletics Association, or NCAA, actually had to issue penalties to the university, on top of placing them on probation, all in response to the discovery of an inappropriate relationship that had been being secretly carried on between one of the female coaches and one of the players. And while this had absolutely nothing to do with Brenda or Joelle, I mean, Brenda hadn't even been a student at NLU at the time, their coaches still started to look down on their friendship because of the rumors that were now seeming to come along with it. Some of the coaches even sat the girls down, much like Ivran, and tried to encourage them to start spending less time together, all in an effort to try to mitigate these rumors. Oh my God, Ivran even at one point called the coaches and asked them to help him get back in Joelle's good graces. Yeah, apparently when he heard that the coaches were unhappy about the friendship between Joelle and Brenda, he took that to mean that they were on his side and that they'd be happy to cross over a myriad of boundaries, all in an effort to get him out of the doghouse, I guess. Ridiculous. And obviously the coach was like, yeah, I don't really know what you want me to do for you, pal. And then I think the conversation just kind of fizzled out from there, but it's just the fact that he had the gall to call and ask one of the coaches to insert themselves into he and Joelle's relationship. I mean, talk about your superiority complex. It's giving narcissist, in my opinion. These girls are going through hell because of a rumor fire that you, sir, are responsible for fueling. And then right in the midst of that, you're going to try and recruit one of your girlfriend's basketball coaches to be your comrade in your control and abuse. Could you not do that? Seriously, Joelle and Brenda were having a terrible time now that everyone thought that they were romantically involved. Their teammates began distancing themselves from them. Their coaches were annoyed. They were being ostracized by their fellow students. I mean, it was just a whole big mess. I mean, the girls tried to ignore the talk and the rumors and the stares, but eventually it really started to become too much, especially for Brenda. She was struggling so much that she started talking more and more to Joelle about potentially giving up life at NLU and just going with her wherever she went post-grad. She was just really struggling a lot with this sudden shift in the environment at school. Sure, things had started out really well, but now it just seemed as though things were getting worse and worse and worse for her by the day. And even worse still, over winter break, while she was home for the holidays, Brenda ended up once again injuring the same knee, the same one that she had just spent months healing with physical therapy after her surgery, fucked it all up again. It was all just too much. When winter break ended and Brenda was forced to return to school after the new year, everything just seemed hopeless. She was so down on herself about the possibility that she could lose her spot on the basketball team, and she was so afraid in her mind of disappointing everyone that she just couldn't do it anymore. And so one night in early 1987, Brenda tried to take her own life. She downed a bunch of medication. I'm not really sure exactly what it was, but nevertheless, whatever she took a bunch of it. Thankfully, though, she was discovered by some of her teammates before it was too late. And after frantically reaching out to the coaches, the team rushed Brenda to the hospital where she was resuscitated. However, she was not out of the woods just yet. Once doctors had pumped her stomach and stabilized her condition, they were fully prepared to admit her to the psychiatric unit for an evaluation. But after hours of assuring doctors that she would not make any further attempts on her life and swearing that she would attend counseling back at school, doctors did ultimately release Brenda after determining that she was likely no longer a risk to herself. And while you'd think that seeing someone in this fragile state would make everyone kind of wake up and realize, like, hey, we kind of been dicks to her, the NLU coaches went a very different direction, and they actually formally kicked Brenda off the basketball team. Because why not kick her when she's down? And this was just the last straw for Brenda. College was nothing like she'd hoped it would be, and she was officially done trying to force herself into this place where she felt she very clearly did not belong. And on February 10th, 1987, Brenda Spicer officially withdrew from her classes at NLU, which, as I'm sure you could guess, was quite the punch in the gut to Joelle. Ivan, on the other hand, well, he saw Brenda dropping out of school as his own personal victory. A victory over Joelle. Brenda had conceded, and now, Joelle, she was all his. Or so he thought. Imagine his surprise, though, when he learned that Joelle and Brenda were still doing everything they could to keep in contact, even after Brenda had left NLU. Yeah, here he thought he'd gotten rid of her when, in actuality, she was still just as much a part of Joelle's life now as she had been when she was still in school. Ooh, he was pissed. I mean, no way was he gonna let Brenda win. Not after all the hard work he'd put in getting her out of the picture. Not after he'd already believed he'd won. No, he had to come up with a plan. A plan to truly rid him and Joelle of Brenda Spicer once and for all. But strap in, because we're not where you think we are yet. You see, he'd tried fighting with fire. He'd tried shoving how he felt about Brenda down both she and Joelle's throats. I mean, Christ, he'd done practically everything other than pee a circle around Joelle to stake his claim on her. However, the one thing that he had seemingly never tried was being kind to Brenda. And given the fact that everything he'd tried so far hadn't worked, he figured, why not? Why not kill her with kindness? Yeah, you didn't think that's where we were going, did you? So Ivan wrote her a letter that he believed Brenda would view as sort of a peace offering. He wanted her to think that their feud was over, that everything they'd been through up to this point was water under the bridge. That with this letter, their beef, as some may call it, was now effectively squashed. And this letter read, quote, Brenda, I hope you're feeling all right now, and I want to apologize for the way I've treated you lately. I'm trying very hard learning to share Joelle with someone else, and I am asking you to bear with me and my efforts. I hope we can both work together in sharing Joelle Tillis. Yeah, Brenda, she didn't love it either. I know that supposedly Ivan was hoping that Brenda would see this letter as an olive branch. However, all it really did was freak her the hell out. She felt as though it read much more like a threat than it did a peace offering. Like, she had always been annoyed by Ivan and his possessiveness over Joelle, but there was something about this letter, something that just made her skin crawl and the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. Her annoyance and her general dislike for Ivan in that moment, in reading that letter, transformed from annoyance to spine-tingling fear. She could tell that Ivan was not planning on giving up this crusade to keep she and Joelle apart. The only question left now was how far was he actually willing to take this battle? She had no way of knowing for sure, but knowing Ivan, she felt as though he intended for this to be a fight to the death. And so out of sheer terror and fear for her own safety, Brenda actually supposedly began keeping a firearm in the glove compartment of her car, just in case. But that said, as scared as she was, she still wasn't willing to cut ties with her friend. She still wasn't willing to give up Joelle, and she was not planning on going down without a fight. But before we get into that, I'm going to take my break, throw on my lashes, and when we get back, Brenda and Ivan's feud comes to a head. Don't go nowhere. All right, so we're back, and prior to our little break, we covered everything there is to cover in this story right up until the evening of Thursday, March 5th, 1987. The NLU women's basketball team was scheduled to play their final regular season game before, hopefully, landing a spot in the NCAA tournament. And for Joelle specifically, this night was particularly important to her because this was the last regular season game of her student career. Her entire life had been leading up to this one singular moment, and now it was here. Everything she'd worked for, everything she'd endured, everything that she had dedicated herself to over the last decade or so, it was all culminating right in front of her at this very game. And you bet your bottom dollar her best friend Brenda was not going to miss this game for the world. She made the trek from her hometown up to NLU a day before the big game, which would have been on Wednesday, March 4th. She was so excited to see Joelle, and she was so proud of all that her friend had accomplished just in the time that they'd known each other, which, mind you, was still less than a year at this point. The only thing that stood to dampen the mood of this trip for Brenda was, of course, Ivran. Because although his drive was like 4 times as long as Brenda's, he too, come hell or high water, was going to be at that game. Actually, both Brenda and Joelle were dreading Ivran's arrival. Brenda, because and Joelle, because things were getting kind of down to the wire for her. After graduation, Ivran was going to expect her to follow through on her promise to marry him. He was expecting them to get married, her to move to New Orleans with him, and for the two of them to start a life together. But according to those who knew Joelle, this was just not at all what she wanted. She was actually planning on breaking things off with Ivran that very weekend, and she discussed these plans in great detail with some of her friends. Plans that, as I'm sure you can guess, stood to do nothing other than infuriate Ivran, which they absolutely did. Following the midday warm-up that the team had scheduled before the big game later that night, Joelle and Ivran, they went out to get some ice cream together, an outing that he viewed as, just a casual little day date. So when he saw Brenda also walk into that ice cream shop, girl, was he pissed. He went 0 to 100 real quick. And to add insult to injury, Brenda wasn't there just to join them for a sundae. No, as soon as she sat down, she and Joelle basically ambushed Ivran. They scolded him for how he'd treated them and for trying to ruin their friendship. They scolded him for the rumors he'd started about them, and basically every negative thing that the two girls had experienced since their friendship started, they were taking out on him. They felt as though they could trace all of it right back to Ivran. And while I'm sure you won't have a hard time believing that inside, Ivran was absolutely fucking fuming, the audacity that these girls would have the danglers to confront him like this, he was every bit as mad as you'd expect him to be. But what you might not be expecting is that for once, he completely held his composure. Even as Joelle explicitly told him she was done with him, Ivran barely even blinked. Instead, he smiled, he looked the girls in the eye, and he told them that he understood. He told them that there were no hard feelings, and that while it would take him time to adjust to everything, that he knew for a fact that sooner rather than later, the three of them could all move past all of this, and they would go on to become great friends.
Okay.
Yeah, Brenda and Joelle were just as shocked as you likely are right now. This was absolutely not the reaction that they'd been expecting. Shoot, the only reason they'd chosen to ambush him in public like this was because they were afraid of how he might react. But now, here they sit, and he seemed to be taking the whole thing in stride, on the chin, if you will. He even told them that he was still fully planning on going to the game that evening to support Joelle. I mean, if this was the end of the story, that'd be great. Unfortunately, though, it's not the end. Not even close. But it would have been nice if it was. Instead, though, Ivran accompanied Brenda and Joelle back to the dorms, where he planned to watch TV in the lounge while Joelle and Brenda got ready for the game. Actually, he even called Brenda while she and Joelle were getting ready, and he apologized to her specifically for everything that had ever gone down between the two of them. Again, something that really surprised Brenda. As did him asking her to meet up with him prior to the game to talk things out and smooth things over. Yeah, Brenda was very hesitant, but ultimately she did eventually end up agreeing to meet with him when he told her that he had a present for Joelle that he wanted to give to her to give to Joelle. Sorry, that was preposterous. And while Brenda really didn't want to go and meet up with Ivran, the whole thing was actually kind of convenient for Joelle because she had a camera that she'd been wanting to get to Ivran so that he could take some pictures of her during that night's game. So, apprehensively, Brenda took the camera, she hopped in her car, and she headed off to meet up with Ivran just before the big game was set to start. Brenda and Ivran met up at I've seen it referred to as a warehouse, but I think it was more like a storage unit type setup. They met just before 6 p.m., which was later confirmed by a gas station attendant who worked across the street that happened to see the two of them standing and talking outside of this warehouse storage unit thing. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to pay attention to them the whole time they were there. He had just happened to notice them like in between taking care of customers that came through the station around that same time. All he managed to catch a glimpse of was the two of them briefly talking. I don't believe he actually even saw them arrive initially, and I know for a fact that he did not see them leave. And I know that because if he had, he would have noticed how weird it was when Ivrin left the warehouse completely alone. Now, Ivrin would later claim that all they did outside the warehouse was talk, and that the only reason he'd asked Brenda to meet up there in the first place was to ask her one last time to please leave he and Joelle alone. But given what I've told you so far about Ivrin, do you think that was why he truly invited her there? If you said that that was absolutely not the reason, then you would be correct. And if you thought it really could be that simple and innocent of an explanation, I'm gonna need you to scrub back to the beginning and listen through to this point again, because you clearly weren't listening the first time around. No, unfortunately, when Ivrin had invited Brenda to meet up with him to talk outside of his storage unit, he had much more sinister plans in mind than just the old pretty please with sugar on top. Initially, the two were speaking as cordially as the two of them possibly could outside the unit. But when Brenda yet again refused to let Ivrin dictate who she could and could not be friends with, Ivrin proceeded to coax Brenda inside of the warehouse. He brought her into his unit, and that is where he finally snapped. All the anger that had been bubbling up inside of him since the ice cream parlor, since all the visits to NLU where he had to shoo Brenda away, shoot all the anger that had been bubbling up inside this man since the very first time he heard Brenda's name. He finally let it all loose, and he channeled all of that anger and rage and fury into finally putting an end to his Brenda problem. Once inside the storage unit, Ivrin jumped on Brenda. He clasped his hands around her throat so hard that he actually crushed the bones in her throat. He raped her. He sodomized her. He choked the life out of her, and then he left her there, dead and defiled, lying on the concrete floor. He then grabbed the camera that Joelle had asked Brenda to give to him. He hopped back in his car, and he hauled ass back to the Coliseum, where he met up with Joelle's family to watch her final game. And as Joelle and her teammates poured onto the court, adrenaline pumping, crowd cheering, it only took Joelle a matter of seconds to scan the crowd and realize that Brenda was not there. Sure, she saw her family and she saw Ivrin, but the only person whose smiling face she truly wanted to see sitting in those stands was evidently a no-show. And while she obviously couldn't let this completely derail her, to say that it did not affect her performance in the game whatsoever, well, that would not be true. She ended up missing a few shots, and she flubbed a couple of plays, furious with herself each and every time. Not only did she know she was better than that, but she also knew full well that Ivrin would definitely have some shit to say about any time she messed up in that game later on. And although that did bother her, she really still couldn't seem to focus on much of anything other than the fact that they were creeping up on halftime, and inexplicably, Brenda still was not there. It was less than 10 minutes before halftime that numerous students would later claim that they saw Ivrin sprinting to his car from the Coliseum. They didn't really think much of it at the time, but of course, Ivrin knew that he had 20 minutes or less to get from the school back to the storage unit to retrieve and dispose of Brenda's body before he would need to be back at the game. The game is his alibi, if you haven't put that together yet. So he raced to his car, he booked it back to the warehouse, he shoved Brenda's body into the passenger seat of his car, and he drove her back to campus. And the whole time he was doing this, he was absolutely frantic. Time was running out. He didn't know what to do or where to go with Brenda, and he was straight bugging about all of the potential evidence he might be getting all over his car. Every second that he drove around trying to decide what to do with Brenda was another second that someone could possibly see him or discover what he had done. And so eventually, just desperate to get rid of the body, Ivrin pulled up behind the campus's science building, and he quickly ditched her body in one of the on-site dumpsters. He then quickly changed his clothes. I guess he had a spare in the back of his car, and then he swapped out his car for Joelle's. I guess since he'd bought the car for her, he had an extra set of keys to it, and he was too scared to drive his own car back to the game because he didn't really have time to clean it or like even check for blood. So he took Joelle's car and drove that back to the Coliseum, and then he sprinted back to the gym where he quickly resumed his seat right next to Joelle's family. And if you're wondering, yes, a lot of people did notice that he'd changed clothes during halftime, and a majority, if not all of them, absolutely thought it was weird. The problem, though, was that their attention was quickly redirected from Ivrin's ensemble back to the game as the second half began, and NLU proceeded to absolutely smoke their opponents, ending the game with a 30-point lead. The crowd went wild, everybody was screaming, the team was celebrating. I mean, this was one of the best nights of their lives up to this point. However, Joelle still could not get over the fact that Brenda had never shown up. After a quick visit with Ivrin and her family, one by one, everyone started to head out. They all had long drives home ahead of them. And while it was usually really difficult for her to say goodbye, especially to her family, this time Joelle was actually kind of eager for everyone to leave. She just wanted to be left alone so that she could finally focus on tracking down Brenda and finding out what had happened when she'd met up with Ivrin. Because she knew for a fact that they had met up because he'd spent the entire game snapping pictures of her with the camera that she had given to Brenda to give to him. So at this point, the main thing that she's really worried about is, did Ivrin finally say something to Brenda to scare her off for good? Did he say something to her that made her mad at Joelle? I mean, tons of scenarios were racing through Joelle's mind, each one more terrible than the one before it. And she did all she could to try and track Brenda down, but as time ticked by and she had no luck, she finally decided that she needed to recruit her teammates as well and her coaches to help her look. Sadly, though, at first, the coaches did not really seem all that concerned. At that point, Brenda had really only been missing for a few hours, so who was to say that she didn't just find something else to do that evening? Or maybe she had straight up decided to just go back home. Sure, it sounds bad in hindsight, but in their defense, I genuinely don't think that murder is the first thing that crosses anyone's mind when they're having trouble tracking someone down, especially not in the 80s. Remember, we're pre-cell phones, pre-computers, at least as we think of them today, so it was a lot easier back then to lose track of someone than it is today. But Brenda's friends and Joelle's teammates knew that there was really no way that Brenda would have missed this game. At least not by choice. It's getting later and later, and no matter where they look or who they talk to, Joelle and the other teammates just cannot seem to track down anyone who had seen or spoke to Brenda after she'd left Joelle's dorm. And so finally, it's like 1 a.m. and Joelle gets a call from Ivrin. She had called him earlier in the evening to find out what had happened, but since he was driving home, he hadn't gotten her message until now. So he calls her back and she just immediately and frantically starts pelting him with questions. She wanted to know everything about what had happened when he and Brenda had met up before the game. And Ivrin was like, I never met up with Brenda. I have no idea what you could possibly be talking about. Bummer for Ivrin, though, is that Joelle immediately knew he was full of shit, because if you'll remember, Ivrin had been at the game with the camera that Joelle had given Brenda to give to him. Whoopsies. And she called him on this as soon as he stopped to take a breath. She told him that she knew he was lying and that he needed to tell her right now what was going on. But no surprise to any of you, I'm sure, Ivrin continued to lie. He told her that he had not met up with Brenda and that he really didn't know anything about where she was. Rather, that the only reason that he had the game was because they had crossed paths on his way to the game, which is when she had given him the camera. So at this point, Joelle she doesn't know what to think. Is he telling her the truth? Is he still lying? How was she supposed to know? She had absolutely no idea what was going on or what to believe. All she knew in her gut was that she had a very, very bad feeling about what was going on with her friend. And this feeling would sadly be confirmed the following morning. It was March 6th, 1987, when an NLU custodian went to empty a trash can into the dumpster behind the science building. And in doing so, he discovered the body of a girl inside. And while I truly truly do feel for the custodian and the mental anguish this must have brought him. I do have to say that it was incredibly lucky that things worked out the way they did. Think about it. If he had dumped the trash the night before when it was dark, or if he'd happened to not look inside the dumpster when he emptied the cans into it, there is a very good chance that Brenda's body would have quickly been covered with trash and concealed long enough for the dumpster to then be emptied. Had this custodian not discovered Brenda when he did, it is very possible and honestly highly probable that no one ever would have. After making the grisly discovery, obviously the custodian called the police, who, upon hearing that a body had been found, initially assumed that it was either a lab cadaver, which, please God, tell me that there's better disposal practices in place for those than just heaving them into a dumpster. But they assumed that it was either a lab cadaver or someone's unwanted baby. But once police arrived on the scene and the investigation really got going, it did not take long for one of the coaches to identify the body as Brenda. Police immediately began looking into Brenda and into those who were close to her, and overwhelmingly, as they began questioning people, one name seemed to come up over and over and over again as the one person who might want to hurt Brenda. You wonder who that could be. Everyone seemed to know about the ongoing feud between Ivan and Brenda over who got Joelle. Police heard seemingly never-ending stories of arguments between Brenda and Ivan, stories of Ivan's jealousy, his possessiveness, his deep-seated hatred for Brenda. I mean, the case was starting to seem like it was going to be open and shut. That is, until they moved on from interviewing students to interviewing some of the NLU staff. These interviews started to confuse police because the teachers and the coaches who knew Ivan, they were putting forth a very different image of him. They described him as a charismatic honor roll student, pre-med from a prominent and well-respected family. To hear them tell it, murderer just did not seem to fit in any spot on Ivan's resume. That said, though, police's suspicion towards Ivan did continue to mount the more they looked into him and the more they investigated he and Brenda and Joelle's toxic relationship. Specifically, it was when they found the note that Ivan had wrote to Brenda, that creepy one about sharing Joelle. Yeah, police seemed to interpret that note a lot more along the lines of how Brenda did, more of a threat than an olive branch. And so when police received a call from the owner of that gas station, the one across the street from the warehouse that Ivan's storage unit was in, and when he told police that he'd seen a young couple matching Brenda and Ivan's descriptions standing and talking across the street from his station the night that Brenda was killed, well, let's just say that this very much piqued police's interest. As did learning that Ivan was, in fact, leasing a storage unit within that warehouse. A unit that, upon inspection, turned out to have what appeared to be blood staining the concrete. Yeah. It's not looking good for old Ivan. Ivan was indicted for second-degree murder on Friday, March 20th, just 2 weeks after he had brutally murdered Brenda. And despite all the rumors that had been swirling around in the weeks following Brenda's death, as word spread that Ivan had actually been arrested and charged, people were really still surprised. Yeah, he was kind of an asshole, but was he really capable of murder? Was he really going to throw away his entire, very promising career and future all over a petty beef with his girlfriend's friend? Honestly, a lot of people weren't buying it. Ivan actually ended up with a lot of support from the community, from his family, from his fellow classmates, from his peers. What was most shocking, though, at least what I found the most shocking, was that Joelle ended up being one of Ivan's most vocal supporters. Yeah, let that one sink in. As I'm sure you won't have a hard time believing, this caused a lot of strife between she and Brenda's former teammates. Because, like, how was it that 1 minute she's Brenda's best friend, and then the next minute she's backing the man accused of killing her? The man that just weeks earlier she was desperate to break free from. It was not a good look. But on the flip side of that, I have seen a lot of varying degrees of speculation as to why Joelle actually decided to back Ivan, because initially she did hold strong on their breakup for a while after he was arrested, but Eventually, over time, he wore her down into taking him back and then crusading for his innocence. And I honestly don't think that anyone other than Ivrin will ever know for sure how or why she took him back and why she became such a public supporter of his. Whether she genuinely believed he was innocent, whether she was scared of him and felt that it was like a keep your friends close, enemies closer type sitch. I've seen some people speculate that he made her think that if she didn't stick by him, he would like take her down with him, try to implicate her as an accomplice. Like I said, these are all theories, but whatever the reason truly was, because we don't know, I do think it's best that we all reserve any possible like knee-jerk reaction we might have to judge Joelle. And I'm not going to pretend that I didn't have to check myself here too. But at the end of the day, she was a victim as well, which, oh God, I haven't even scratched the surface of that one yet. Yeah, we've still got a long way to go. But I really don't want to see any like trash talking of Joelle in the comments because, like I said, we don't know exactly what she was going through or why she made some of the decisions that she did. If we've never been in that situation and we don't know how we'd react, it's asinine of us to assume that we would do things better or in a different way than she did. Anyways, Ivrin did sit in jail for a while, pending his trial. However, after a judge denied his attempts to have his bail reduced, his family agreed to put up his father's business as collateral, and Ivrin ended up being released and allowed to wait for his trial at home. And honestly, he was feeling pretty confident as he prepared for the trial. As the initial shock had worn off from Brenda's murder and small town Louisiana did its thing, rumors started circulating about Brenda and Joelle and their supposed lesbian love affair, which was undoubtedly particularly salacious in the 80s in a small conservative southern town. So even as rumors about Ivrin came up, like rumors that he'd supposedly beat a previous girlfriend of his, he still thought that he had a good case. His lawyer thought he had a good case. Ivrin thought he had a good lawyer. And he might have been a good lawyer, but he wasn't a lucky man because freakishly, just a little bit before Ivrin's trial was set to begin, his attorney got struck by lightning and died. Yeah, what are the fucking odds? Obviously, this tragedy ended up pushing the trial back a bit because now Ivrin's got to find a new and hopefully less conductive attorney. And while he did so, he also did his best to try and return to as normal of a life as one possibly can when facing murder charges. He returned to his classes at LSU. He and Joelle moved in together. Even when he ultimately flunked out of med school, he still maintained his presence in college by enrolling in a graduate chemistry program. And at this point, regardless of why she had initially decided to take him back, Joelle really did seem like she truly believed in Ivrin's innocence now. She frequently brushed off people's accusations against him. She defended him whenever his name was brought up. She even came up with alternative theories as to who could have killed Brenda and why. And she proudly asserted these theories to whoever would listen whenever she felt it was necessary. Oh, and above all else, she frequently made mention of how ridiculous the witch hunt against Ivrin had been because he was innocent. They were wasting all their time trying to pin this on Ivrin while somewhere out there, Brenda's killer was still roaming around, free to potentially do this again. And when I tell you, oh, that is just deeply ironic, well, you just wait. Ivrin's trial began in March of 1988 with the prosecution arguing basically exactly what had happened. They argued that Ivrin Balden Jr. had murdered Brenda Spicer out of jealous rage over the friendship that she shared with his girlfriend, Joelle Tillis. And although Ivrin had managed to trudge up supporters over the years, by the time his trial rolled around, there appeared to be no shortage of witnesses that could be called to back up the prosecution's theory. They called dozens of people to testify, all of whom were familiar with Ivrin and how he was, and his possessiveness and his control over Joelle. They testified to the inexplicable jealousy he harbored towards Brenda from the beginning of her friendship with Joelle. It's crazy how, nail on the head the prosecution's argument was. The defense's argument, however, directly contradicted those testimonies. They even called Joelle herself to testify, which she did. She testified to how wonderful and kind and caring of a boyfriend Ivrin had always been. She did everything she could to minimize not just her friendship with Brenda, but also the feud between she and Ivrin. She even offered up some of her many alternative theories and suspects in an effort to, I guess, widen the very narrow tunnel vision that everyone had seemed to have on Ivrin over the preceding year. And we know what happened, so her testimony doesn't really sway us one way or another. But for the jury, it had to have been pretty impactful to hear this supposed victim of abuse completely negate and deny said abuse in a court of law and under oath. Oh, and another pretty compelling testimony was that of Joelle's mother. She testified that Ivrin had escorted her to the basketball game at the Coliseum that night, right around 6 p.m., and she claimed that he had been sitting right there with her in the bleachers throughout the entire game. And while we know that this wasn't true, unfortunately, Joelle's mother's testimony in court came across as a lot more credible than that of the gas station clerk who had seen Brenda and Ivrin the night of the murder. And then, last but certainly not least, Ivrin himself took to the stand in order to testify on his own behalf. And this is typically pretty unprecedented. Most of the time, lawyers are really against this. They don't want their clients testifying because more often than not, all it does is open them up to brutal cross-examination. But in this case, if Ivrin was anything other than guilty, it was confident. He got up on the stand and, hand to God, he told the jury that at the very most, he was only ever moderately irritated by Brenda. That sure, she wasn't his favorite person in the world, but that she certainly didn't bother him enough for him to want her dead. And then, other than that, he spent pretty much the entire time on the stand bragging about himself and about his accomplishments in an effort to convince the jury that he was nothing short of a gift to society. The jury deliberated for about 3 hours once both sides had presented their arguments, and when they returned to the courtroom, they presented the judge with their verdict of not guilty. Yep. That's right. Ivrin was a free man. He had officially gotten away with murder. He could never be tried for the death of Brenda Spicer ever again. Police did reopen Brenda's case following Ivrin's acquittal, but as we know, no amount of additional investigation into her death could ever see to it that the correct person saw justice. That's not to say, though, that everything was all sunshine and rainbows and butterflies for Ivrin following his acquittal. He never got to become a doctor like he'd planned. He actually never even graduated from LSU at all. And although technically he'd been found not guilty, I can't imagine for a second that a murder trial doesn't follow a person around forever. Pretty much the only thing that Ivrin still had going for him in life was Joelle. The two eventually moved from Louisiana to Tennessee to try and start fresh. Ivrin found a job working security, and Joelle got a job working at a ladies' Foot Locker. They really tried to move on, but over time, it became increasingly obvious to both of them that neither of them were really happy. They fought constantly, sometimes verbal, sometimes physical, sometimes both. Joelle even ended up in the hospital with a sprained wrist once as a result of one of their knockdown, drag-out arguments. She did tell the doctor, though, that she'd injured herself working out. So, I mean, these two were a toxic mess, constantly cheating on one another, constantly leaving one another. Neither of them felt fulfilled in their lives. They were both just going through the motions. In public, they tried to put on the old happy couple charade, but behind closed doors, things were getting more and more volatile by the day. Joelle had been stuck in this nightmare since college, and she just wanted to finally be free. Which brings us to May 18th, 1989. Joelle and Ivrin started their day that Thursday, similar to how they started most days, with an argument. They were eventually seen out at breakfast together that morning, but just before noon that day, Joelle ended up calling a friend of hers and begging her to come and pick her up from she and Ivrin's home. I believe she and Ivrin only had one vehicle. That's why she needed this friend's help. But before her friend could answer, the phone line went dead. And although she tried to call her back, Joelle's friend was never able to get back a hold of her. Now, there's really no way for us to know exactly what Ivrin and Joelle were arguing about this time around, but what we do know for sure is that this fight would prove to be their last. Following that phone call, Ivrin had ripped the phone cord out of the wall as Joelle desperately tried to call for help. He then grabbed her by the throat, rammed her into their bed, and he strangled her there, squeezing her so hard that her neck ultimately snapped, killing her instantly. She had been right all those years. Brenda's killer was on the loose, and he would strike again. Devastatingly, though, this time it was Joelle herself whose life was taken. 6 years of toxicity, 6 years of fights, 6 years of control and jealousy and abuse. It all culminated to this moment. Ivrin had finally exercised complete and total dominance and control over Joelle, this time to the point of no return. This time, she was dead, and if he didn't act quick, he knew that it wouldn't take long for her death to be linked back to him. He had to get her out of their apartment and put as much distance as he possibly could between he and her body. One, teeny little problem with that, though. The apartment complex, the one he needed to sneak a dead body out of, yeah, it was crawling with cops. Nothing to do with Ivrin at the moment, although that would have been crazy ironic. But in actuality, they just happened to be there for some unrelated drug bust in a separate apartment. So while they weren't there for him, they were certainly going to complicate things for him. But Ivrin was cool under pressure. He'd gotten away with murder once, and he could do it again, right? He thought so. So he bided his time. I mean, obviously he couldn't waltz out the door with Joelle's body right in front of the cops that were raiding the apartment across the hall. But that didn't mean that he couldn't do other stuff to prepare. He got the apartment back together. He got Joelle's body ready for disposal. He changed her out of her work shirt, hoping that it would make it more difficult for police to identify her when she inevitably was found. He then wrapped her body up in their bed sheets. He cleaned himself up, and confident and satisfied with his work, he truly felt as though he'd thought of everything. So when police cleared the area, Ivrin loaded Joelle into his car, and he just started driving. He drove, and he drove, and he drove until he drove just plumb out of Tennessee. He drove for just under an hour until he came upon a remote area that he felt as though would be perfect for dumping the love of his life. Ivrin dumped Joelle's body into a ditch just outside Forest City, Arkansas, and he covered it up with leaves and dirt and sticks before he then left it there and headed home. And that is just so cold and callous to me. In my opinion, it just proves that he never loved Joelle. He loved the idea that he could control her. He killed Brenda in hopes of regaining control over her, and then as soon as he felt like he was losing her again, with no one else to blame this time, he killed her. His objective was only ever control. Ironically, though, for Ivrin, by killing Joelle to regain control, he actually was basically forfeiting it. Because it did not take long for people to take notice that Joelle was missing. For starters, she didn't show up for her shift at Foot Locker that afternoon, which was not like her. And on top of that, a few of her friends also noticed she was missing, and they called Ivrin and tried to find out from him where she was. The real clincher, though, I'd say, in getting the ball rolling and Joelle getting discovered was her friend, the one who she'd called right before Ivrin killed her. Yeah, that friend was eventually finally able to get a call back through to the apartment, and when she did, Ivrin picked up and she asked where Joelle was, and Ivrin told her that he didn't know. She wasn't there. And after some back and forth, she ended up telling him that if he didn't go to the police and report Joelle missing, that she was going to. And surprisingly, he actually heeded this warning, and on May 19th, just a day after he had killed her, Ivrin went to the Memphis police station and he filed a formal missing persons report on Joelle. He told them he had dropped her off at work the previous day and that he had no idea why she'd never showed up. He didn't know where she could have gone, and he didn't know where she could possibly be. And police, taking this down, they weren't stupid. They knew Ivrin, they knew about his past, and they were definitely side-eyeing him more than a little bit. They were squinting, but no matter how hard they tried, they just could not come up with any evidence to substantiate any sort of foul play narrative. So although Ivrin was like their number one suspect, they had nothing to hold him on. He was free to go, and go he did, straight to Florida. Like he moved to Florida just, I don't know, a couple of days after he murdered Joelle, which is like totally not suspicious at all. No, it's super cash. Meanwhile, poor Joelle, her body wasn't discovered for almost a month. It wasn't until Sunday, June 11th, that a man who was out hunting with his dog stumbled across her. And then, once the police were called and her body was taken in for autopsy, it took an additional 5 days to identify her, which they had to do using dental records. Joelle's autopsy concluded that her cause of death was strangulation, which police were still sure that Ivern was responsible for. The problem, though, was that Joelle's body had been discovered in Arkansas, but the crime was believed to have taken place in Tennessee, so basically no one really knew who had jurisdiction or who should take the lead. And honestly, kind of seemed like neither department really wanted the case, which is gross. Apparently, neither of them wanted to take it because they thought it would cost too much money to investigate, and so why should one department pay when they could possibly get the other one to pay? Like I always say, profit over people. Truly though, how are you not embarrassed to behave like this? To swear to serve and protect and then to let a murder investigation fall through the cracks because you don't want to delegate the resources to it? If you think I'm exaggerating, I'm not. Nothing ended up happening as far as the investigation into Joelle's death was concerned for years. And it really wasn't even police who ended up cracking the case, but let me stay on track. Once he felt as though the dust had settled and as if he could truly start fresh, Ivern relocated again, this time from Florida to Jersey. He got a job working at a dairy factory, he got a part-time counseling job, and he got himself a new lady friend. He was vibing. Seriously, he was just living his life, doing his thing, moving on as if he had not just full-on murdered a whole ass other woman. But he couldn't hide his past forever. You see, it wasn't long until his new relationship started to go the way of all his previous ones. Down the toilet. And during a particularly heated argument, this was in the spring of 1991, Ivern and his new girlfriend, they're arguing. I think he was trying to break up with her and she just was not having it. And as a last-ditch effort to get her to leave him alone, Ivern flat out told her that he had killed a woman before and that she needed to stop pushing him. Basically threatening that if she didn't back off, he'd kill her next. But this girl was ruthless. She did not give a fuck. He dumped her and basically threatened to kill her. And in response, she broke into his apartment and trashed it. And I'm not gonna lie, it was kind of hilarious. I mean, if you ever find yourself in a similar headspace, I'd suggest not doing that. Just touch grass and move on. No one's worth that. But there's nothing I can do to change the fact that this girl did it, so it's funny. Of course, once he realized what had happened, he was super angry. Angry is basically his default setting anyway, so this really pissed him off. He was so mad that he called the police on her and tried to file a restraining order, as if he ain't secretly a killer. And when police went to question her, she's like, "The hell are you talking to me about? He's the one who's killed someone before." And police are like, "I'm sorry. You said what now?" And so she proceeded to tell them everything about his little confession and about how he'd basically threatened to do the same thing to her. And this was suspicious enough, but when you couple it with the fact that he'd also recently tried to get a gun, I mean, he'd been denied because of his arrest back in '87, but the fact that this supposed confessed murderer was trying to acquire a gun, it looked bad. And when Memphis heard about this, they actually agreed to finally put their money where their mouth was and do something about Joelle's death. Her case was reopened in late April, with Memphis detectives making the 16-hour journey up to Jersey specifically to administer a polygraph test to Ivern, which he failed. But even with this, it still took police 5 hours of very intense interrogation to finally break this man down. But the important thing is that they did. He finally confessed. He confessed to murdering Joelle, and plot twist, he also confessed to murdering Brenda. I mean, obviously he can't be retried for her death, but I don't know, I think it's crazy that he confessed after all those years. Following his confession, Ivern was arrested and he was extradited to Memphis, where he was expected to stand trial for Joelle's murder. But Ivern knew that he basically won the lottery in '88, and there really was not a snowball's chance in hell that he was possibly gonna get that lucky again. At least he wasn't willing to risk it. Instead, he agreed to plead guilty to voluntary manslaughter in exchange for a 10-year prison sentence. Yeah, 10 years. That was it. Yeah, no one was particularly jazzed about it. The man had killed 2 women, and he was getting the legal equivalent of a slap on the wrist. I think we can all agree that 10 years was not enough. Prosecutors did try and slap him with perjury charges for lying under oath during his first trial, kind of like in the Mel Ignato and Brenda Schaefer case. Ew, it's weird that both their names are Brenda. Ew, and both of their last names start with S. Ugh, they're all connected. Ivern was ultimately found guilty of perjury during his 88 trial, but unfortunately, his sentence for that charge, 10 years. And it was designated to run concurrently rather than consecutively with his 10 years for Joelle's death. Basically meaning that he got no real additional time to serve in response to his perjury. And if you think 10 years wasn't enough, guess what? He only served 7 before he was released on parole in 1998. Yeah, dude. He's out. I don't know a lot about what he's up to now. He seems to have made a pretty big effort to try and stay out of the public eye since his release. I think he moved back to Louisiana, got a job with his dad, and got married, but beyond that, as far as what he's up to presently, your guess is as good as mine. And with that, you guys, we are about wrapped for today. Let me know your thoughts on this case in the comments down below. Do you think that 10, or I guess really 7 years was enough? 7 years for the lives he took? No? Good. Me neither. Truly though, can you imagine how gut-wrenching this all must have been for Joelle's family? Not only did they view him as a member of their family, but Joelle's mom was basically the reason that Ivern was acquitted of Brenda's murder. The jury from his first trial literally said that because she was so much more convincing in her alibi testimony for Ivern than the gas station attendant was, that was why they acquitted him. Like, I cannot even imagine what it would have been like living with the fact that you lied and kept this man out of jail just for him to ultimately go on to murder your daughter. It makes me sick to think about. Rest in peace to both Joelle and to Brenda. Regardless of your opinions on some of the decisions they made throughout this story, neither of them deserve to lose their lives in the horrific and brutal ways that they did. They were both so young and so talented, and they had so much potential. It's really sad. Yeah. As always, I thank you guys so much for taking the time to watch this video and to listen to this story. Courtney, thank you for requesting it. It was a whirlwind. If you have a case or a topic you'd like to see me cover, please fill out the case submission form that I have linked in the description. And if by chance you're interested, you can also find all of the information and links for all of the products that I used throughout today's video. If you haven't already and you'd like to, go ahead and subscribe to my channel. I put out new videos almost every week, so if you turn on your post notifications, you'll always know when I do post, and you'll always be sure to catch me back here in my next one. But until then, stay safe and have a good week. Bye! Titty sweating, fucking beating up on my forehead. Basically, Here the fuck we go. Here the fuck we go. Oh, bitch, it's hot in here. Fuck you and you whole, fuck you and your whole ass fucking bitch. Ivern's parents, they were... Are you done? Hello? I have 7,000 brushes in my hand. Well, I have a feeling this eyeshadow is going to become just a part of who I am. Wow, I'm not doing well at this. My shaky, shaky little handsies. Ew. That's so nasty sounding.